Good afternoon. My name is Brian Meeks. I'm chair of Africana Studies here at Brown, and I suppose therefore I should also welcome you belatedly here and to congratulate Juliet and Melvin on this remarkable gathering of scholars, some of whom I know and some of whom I'm meeting for the first time, but what a gathering. Juliet, where are you? She's in the room, but congratulations. Tell her I said congratulations. It follows, in fact, in the wake of another conference that we held in Africana last week called 50 Years Since 68, the Global and the Local. And there's a way in which there's, even though it's only for the grad students and faculty from Brown who were here at that conference to know that there's a synergy between the two of them, because in a sense this takes off where that one left in addressing a whole range of questions related to black politics in the now and here, as opposed to the reflection on 68. So there was no plan in that, but it works. I want to introduce our two panelists this afternoon. The first person is Alexander Livingston, and his paper is titled Love, Law, and Civil Disobedience. Alexander Livingston is an assistant professor in the Department of Government and fellow at the Society for the Humanities at Cornell University. He's the author of Damn Great Empires. Damn Great Empires, or Damn Great Empires?
Exclamation point.
William James and the Politics of Pragmatism, as well as numerous articles and chapters on democracy, race, religion, and American political thought. He's currently writing a book on the genealogy of civil disobedience and the politics of nonviolence in the U.S. civil rights and anti-war movements. Deva Woodley, her paper is entitled To Dream a World, Radical Imagination, Black Feminist Pragmatism, and the Movement for Black Lives. Deva Woodley is assistant professor of politics at the New School, a former fellow of the Institute for Advanced Study. She's the author of The Politics of Common Sense, How Social Movements Use Public Discourse to Change Politics and Win Acceptance. And her current book projects are Hashtag Black Lives Matter, The Democratic Necessity of Social Movements, an examination of the ways that social movements repoliticize public life in times of political despair, and what we talk about when we talk about the economy. I want to see that when it comes out. What do we talk about? A broad investigation of American economic discourse and its implications for politics and policy in the post-Great Recession era. We're going to have Alexander first, then Deva, 20 minutes each, and then half an hour for discussion. Alexander.
Okay. So let me begin by thanking Juliet and Melvin for putting together this wonderful event and for being so kind as to invite me to participate. And to Michelle for all the administrative help putting up with my bad email habits. So what I want to present today, what I pre-circulated around, is part of this book project on the politics of nonviolence. And it's a new chapter I wrote that was shaped by an experience I had this summer when I was asked to review a new volume on the political thought of Martin Luther King, edited by Tommy Shelby and Brandon Terry. And the premise of that volume is that here on sort of the 50th anniversary of King's death, it's time to recover King as a political theorist, not simply as the object of political theory, but a subject with his own wide corpus of political theorizing. And it's a landmark volume. It's very, very good. There are really exceptional essays in it. But one thing I noticed running through it was a deep uneasiness that took the form of acknowledging King as a political thinker depended no small part on bracketing King as a religious thinker. That these two things had to be kept separate as the condition of his canonization. And there are really three strategies I saw across these volumes. There are exceptions, of course, in the volume as well, but the first is to acknowledge the presence of religious arguments and discourse in King's political thought, but to identify alongside those secular principles we might appeal to for appraising or applying or reconsidering those arguments. The second is to acknowledge the constitutive role of religious thought in King's politics, but to argue that the content of religious arguments can be translated out into secular terms without loss or remainder. And the third is to simply just ignore the religious talk when we're talking about King on economic justice, gender, nonviolence, what have you. I mentioned this because I was unsettled seeing this in the volume because I recognized each one of these strategies as strategies I have engaged in my own writing about King in this book on civil disobedience, and that is to find a certain uneasiness with religious argumentation in this context. So I took that as an opportunity to raise two questions to myself. And the first is, what do we lose or what do we miss about the study of black political thought when we segregate religion from politics, and how might we learn about racing political concepts by taking religious arguments seriously? So with that, I'm going to give you my current reflections on that. The gospel of love rang loud in American politics during the era of civil rights. Civil disobedience was love in action. Integration promised to redeem the nation as a beloved community. Black students were asked to love angry white parents who could not love themselves. The classic phase of the civil rights struggle wielded love as a creative weapon in its crusade against Jim Crow. Yet for all of love's dramatic presence in the rhetoric and ideology of the black freedom struggle, it has remained conspicuously absent from political theory's discussions of civil disobedience. Martin Luther King and the iconography of the civil rights movement have become synonymous with civil disobedience, yet scholars have reoriented the discussion of nonviolence and conscientious resistance from the rule of love to the rule of law. Aaron gave us an account, sort of one way of thinking about how that comes about. What gets lost when political theory segregates love from politics, I argue, are the freedom dreams at the heart of the paradoxical union of civility and disobedience. Love, to borrow Ralph Ellison's phrase, speaks on lower frequencies than law. Now, one way political theory might tune into these lower frequencies is to ask, what was the question to which civil disobedience was the answer? Jim Crow was not only a system of legal subordination, but a caste society founded on fear. This fear was not simply the private sentiment, but a public tool of social control. From the spectacular violence of the lynch mob to the more quotidian forms of oppression, African Americans were taught that survival depended on rigorously observing the rules and customs of racial subordination. Fear, in other words, was a weapon of spiritual warfare white supremacy wielded to teach blacks to accept their oppression. Civil disobedience emerged in the black freedom struggle as a political and spiritual response to the rule of fear. Now, Robin Kelly remarks that love is, quote, one of the most revolutionary ideas available to us, and yet as intellectuals we have failed miserably to grapple with its political and analytical importance. This essay is an attempt to take up Kelly's challenge and grapple with the meaning of love and the theory and history of civil disobedience in the context of the long civil rights movement. Love, I argue, was the core concept of a vernacular black political theology of resistance. Loving is not liking. It is not positive regard for another person, but service to a neighbor, even a neighbor who hates. Where liking presumes the separateness of individuals and the autonomy of self, agape acknowledges interdependence and the need to relinquish attachment to the self in order to become what King calls a person. The labor of love, and this is King, is, quote, to see that you are an adjective, not a noun, constituted through bonds of interdependence with others as children of God. Learning freedom from fear is therefore learning freedom from the self, to build the beloved community where the personality of each is made possible through the personality of all. He who seeks to find his life shall lose it, Christ tells his disciples, and he who loses it for my sake shall find it. Civil disobedience's disciplined self-suffering and self-sacrifice constitute rituals of losing the self in order to reclaim it anew. Now, my proposal is that we would do well to approach black political thought, not simply, or black political theology, not simply as a language in politics, but a language of politics, in order to consider religion as a resource rather than a liability for political theorizing, one offering potential moral insights to even secular citizens capable of expanding their political vocabularies and imaginations. As Danielle Allen argues, political theory often lacks the language to conceptualize the interdependence of our shared fate. When it comes to seeing how strangers are related to each other, she writes, we are aphasic. Love is such a way of seeing interdependence in a new light and reimagining its implications for dignity and dissent in the face of oppression. Now, the paper I circulated pursues this argument by way of a historical and philosophical interrogation of King's retelling of the moment when civil disobedience is said to have burst into flame in the American scene, the Montgomery bus boycott. The first section situates the origins of King's philosophy of nonviolence in the works of an earlier generation of black theologians who sought to learn lessons from India's anti-colonial struggle. The second considers the implications of this tradition alongside King's sermons for interpreting Stride Toward Freedom's claim that nonviolent resistance in Montgomery gave rise to, quote, a new Negro with a new sense of dignity and destiny. And the third considers the same argument from the other side of the color line for conceptualizing the moral psychology of the white citizen and its implications for civil disobedience. Rather than an evasion of white refusal to acknowledge black humanity, King's insistence on civil disobedience illustrates the challenge of binding political confrontation with political pedagogy that characterizes what he calls aggressive love. So I'm going to kind of go through those 3 points, or those 3 sections. Now, Stride Towards Freedom's retelling of King's personal pilgrimage to nonviolence has become synonymous with the origin story of civil disobedience in the United States. Conspicuously absent from this genealogy of Thoreau and others King constructs is any acknowledgement of his debts to a previous generation of African American political thinkers and their decades of experimentation with Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence. Howard University in the 1930s, under the leadership of Mordecai Johnson in particular, became an important laboratory for translating Gandhian spiritual politics to a novel approach to confronting Jim Crow. 2 theological luminaries of Howard's School of Divinity, Howard Thurman and Benjamin Mays, traveled to India in the 1930s to learn from Gandhi and report back his lessons for injecting religion into politics for the struggle against global white supremacy. Why Gandhi? Jim Crow offered African Americans a brutal education and subordination. Everyday experiences of repression, disrespect, and vulnerability to arbitrary violence taught them to conform to the rules of white supremacy because their very survival depended upon it. Performances of racial submission that protected some from bodily violence came at the cost of a psychic violence, however, a double consciousness that measured one's own self-worth through an internalized white gaze. Thurman described this psychic violence by distinguishing mere survival from what he called not being killed. Survival concerns protecting one's bodily integrity from pain and suffering. Not being killed, by contrast, is an existential issue of preserving one's moral integrity and self-respect. That is, how to sustain a sense of one's own personhood in the face of white supremacy's relentless diminishment of black humanity. Thurman names the existential challenge of preserving self-respect in the face of oppression the problem of creative survival. Psychologically, this is a question of how to resist the loss of self-respect and feelings of inferiority that racism breeds amongst the oppressed. Morally, it is a question of how to affirm the human worth of the dispossessed as a spur to action. Looking abroad to India was a catalyst for reimagining how to empower black self-respect and uproot the stigma of racial inferiority through collective struggle. I think it's worthwhile to think or acknowledge the perception of Gandhi in the United States in the 1930s is really shaped by 2 images. The first is Gandhi as Christ figure, and that's true on both sides of the color line, but also Gandhi as race leader in the black press in particular, and sort of a global movement of the dark races that Gandhi is seen as, akin to someone like Garvey. Okay. The longer paper examines Thurman and May's experiments with translating satyagraha to a political theology of black self-respect, most critically in Thurman's 1949 Jesus and the Disinherited, which King is said to have carried in his coat pocket throughout the bus boycott, in order to reconsider King's account of the self-respect enhancing powers of nonviolence. The originality and power of King's contributions to the tradition of African American nonviolence is sometimes said to lie in the clarity of his moral and political vision rather than the theoretical articulation of nonviolent techniques. While there's some truth to this claim, dichotomizing moral vision and political strategy in this way obscures their interdependence with a broader spiritual framework informing King's account of what it means to triumph over fear, that placing his vision of civil disobedience within this longer tradition of black religious thought draws out. Now, in the summer of 1957, as he was revising the manuscript of the book on the boycott, Stride Toward Freedom, King delivered a series of sermons at Dexter on the meaning of self-respect or integrated personality. The first sermon addresses the issue of the oppressed's feelings of inferiority. At the core of the inferiority complex lies an ego divided against itself that motivates self-defeating forms of disavowal, whether they be alcoholism, despair, or hatred. King counsels his congregation to overcome these feelings and affirm their worth through selfless commitment to something larger than their private selves, whether it be labor, service, or faith. It is only through losing the ego in, quote, some great cause, some great purpose, some great ideal, some great loyalty, that the individual makes himself over into a person. Finding parallels between scripture and psychoanalysis, King preaches that the best way to master the experience of fear and doubt born of a split ego is not to suppress, but, quote, to extend the ego into objectively meaningful channels. This distinction between the ego and the person is an artifact of King's theological personalism. Personalism figures God and man as two aspects of a single person, one finite and the other infinite. Finite human persons are children of God and recipients of his love. Their worth is absolute and unconditional because they are expressions of God as a supreme person. Infinite personality names the invisible but creative forces that act in history to unite all creation and all finite persons. Loving fellowship is therefore required to become more than a shadow of oneself, for in coming closer to other finite persons, one comes closer to God. To love is, quote, to project an I onto the thou and see that it is only through the thou that the I is saved from being depersonalized as an it. This is what King calls agape, quote, love seeking to preserve and create community. Oppression, in other words, depersonalizes the oppressed. Segregation is the antithesis of community. Policing the color line is a way of refusing to acknowledge the interdependence of persons and therefore a refusal to return God's love. It denies the equal dignity of the oppressed and so stunts their personality by denying them the bonds of fellowship that would allow them to flourish. The duty to preserve community is therefore one and the same as the duty to resist oppression. Resisting oppression and service to God are only two sides of the same coin. Dismantling the barriers of the beloved community, both within and without, is a process of overcoming the self, throwing off fear, and coming closer to God. As he preaches in a line that appears almost verbatim in Stride's description of the spiritual effects of the boycott campaign, King writes, accepting God's love offers, quote, a new sense of dignity and a new sense of belonging. So nonviolent resistance and faith have the same transformative effect because they're two faces of the same thing. In his classic, Black Theology and Black Power, James Cone asks what it could mean to love the white neighbor when, by the time of King's death, the dream of racial integration had come to look like a fantasy. To love the white man, he answers, means that the black man confronts him as a thou without any intention of giving ground and becoming an it. Black self-respect is enacted through fearless resistance to white oppression. Confident of God's love in him and his blackness, the black man loves the white neighbor by refusing the racist images he projects onto him and forcing the white man to acknowledge him as an equal. This struggle for recognition is not bound by nonviolence, however. Nonviolence is white ideology. It was King's willingness to turn the other cheek that made him so beloved by whites, Cone argues, and so misleading as a model for struggle in the era of Black Power. Now, Cone's conclusion resonates with contemporary criticisms of the very idea of civil disobedience. Demands for civility, critics charge, have become a way of deflecting activist challenges to the status quo by faulting them for failing to abide by moralized standards of propriety that King's legacy has ironically come to symbolize. This is civility as an ideal of etiquette or good manners that mystifies relations of power that activists seek to challenge. Rejecting nonviolence and embracing uncivil disobedience, some argue, would better serve activists because of the uncivil protest's alleged ability to radically disrupt the status quo. Missing from this embrace of uncivil disruption is the antithesis of civil persuasion, is a sense of the paradox of civil disobedience that King's talk of fidelity to love invites us to inhabit. Political disruption comes cheap. The challenge of civil disobedience is how to mobilize political disruption in the service of a political pedagogy that provokes both activists and audience to reimagine themselves and the ties that bind them. Here, disobedience and civility, understood broadly as disciplined self-limitation rather than good manners, pull in opposing directions to create space for persuasion in the face of power rather than turning a blind eye to it. Civility, in other words, is a critical element of what King called Christ's example of responding to oppression with aggressive love. Now, theorizing civil disobedience as aggressive love puts some pressure on the criticism of the moral psychology of nonviolent suasion raised by civility's critics. Nonviolent resistance is premised on a profound skepticism concerning the power of conscientious persuasion to resolve political conflicts. The purpose of nonviolence is to create the conditions for persuasion in the face of material and ideational barriers to mutual understanding. This is what King means by describing nonviolent resistance as the ultimate form of persuasion that seeks justice by, quote, appealing to the conscience of the great decent majority who through blindness, fear, pride, or irrationality have allowed their conscience to sleep. Appeals to conscience cannot be taken for granted. The conscience of the oppressor must first be provoked to wakefulness by dramatic and disruptive acts of resistance. Love is no empty sentiment, it is something confrontational and aggressive. The white conscience's deafness to the claims of justice is illustrative of how segregation harms both oppressor and oppressed. Just as it creates an atmosphere of fear to impose a sense of inferiority on the oppressed, it also divides the white psyche and shackles it to irrational, albeit deadly serious fears. Again, working the intervals between scripture and psychoanalysis, King offers an etiology of white resistance as a case study in how fear strangles self-respect. Desegregation is a screen whites project their fear onto in order to disavow their guilt. This guilt is an unconscious acknowledgement of the injustice of segregation. They are complicit beneficiaries of a system that diminishes human dignity and contradicts their own professed moral commitments. Imagined horrors of violent retribution and racial intermarriage project the danger outside the self and overwhelms inward self-examination. Whites turn to violent resistance to repress, in both the political and psychological sense of the term, moral provocations that might force them to honestly confront themselves. Oh boy. The souls of white folk, in other words, are afflicted by disintegrated personality, no less than the oppressed. Through oppression, they depersonalize themselves and create an experience of a divided ego racked with the guilt and anxiety, and their attempts to disavow this reality by clinging to self-defeating compensations only shackles themselves ever tighter to their fear. The only way to honestly confront this guilt complex and escape the psychosis of whiteness is to imagine the self as a person completed through racial equality rather than undone by it. White folk suffer from an unfulfilled need for fellowship that leaves them only fragments of their proper selves. Only love can answer this need. King writes, since the white man's personality is greatly distorted by segregation and his soul is greatly scarred, he needs the love of the Negro. The Negro must love the white man because the white man needs his love to remove his tensions, insecurity, and fear. Okay, I'm going to cut this short because I'm running out of time. Aggressive love, therefore, means breaking through the white psychological defense mechanisms that stir their conscience to action. One means of breaking through the ego's defense is through suffering. In her recent study of King's political realism, Kruna Mantena identifies 3 ways disciplined suffering can break through these psychological barriers and create space for conscientious persuasion. Disciplined suffering exposes evil to the public eye, it foils anticipations of violent response and throws the aggressor off balance, it redirects the aggressor's dazed attention back upon himself to provoke shame and self-evaluation. Where the guilty conscience disavows responsibility by projecting its anxieties out onto the oppressed as a source of danger, the suffering body serves as a mirror rather than a screen, deflecting the ego's projection and revealing the guilty conscience of itself. Disrupting the expectation of retaliation or revenge that recursively justifies the guilty conscience's use of violence as preemptive self-defense, suffering disarms the aggressor and creates the possibility for seeing themselves beyond the terms of the ego's defensive projections. I'll do this last bit, and I'll stop. Loving means never losing sight of the ultimate end of converting the enemy into a friend. The idea of aggressive love, however, underscores the fraught nature of loving an enemy as if this ideal were already a reality, however. Before oppressors are moved by their claims, the oppressed must compel them to listen. Coercive disruption, in other words, is a precondition of pedagogical persuasion rather than its antithesis. At the inaugural mass meeting of the MIA, King told the audience that if their protest was to succeed, they must use both, quote, the tools of persuasion and the tools of coercion. Nonviolent direct action intervenes in a field of power, not by rising above coercion, but by mobilizing it in a way that holds open the possibility of moral reflection. This is aggressive love in action. It is selflessly responding to the need of the neighbor for fellowship, even where this means forcing him to be free. Agape, he writes, is insistence on community, even when one seeks to break it. So I've run out of time. I'm going to end there. But I'll say, sort of, what are 3 insights we get from this religious tradition? It's 1, thinking about love as a form of self-liberation. Love is articulating claims, a language for claiming justice, and a perspective for thinking through the psychic life of power that attends to the interdependence, interrelation of political subjects. Thank you.
I'm going to stay seated, if that's okay with everybody. I want this to feel like more of a workshop to myself because I am workshopping my book with you. So I want to start out by thanking everybody, Juliet, Melvin, Michelle, and everyone involved. It's been such an enlightening conference so far. Today, I am presenting a part of a book that I'm working on, Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Necessity of Social Movements, which is a book that's trying to do a bunch of different things at once, and I haven't quite figured out how to do all of them. It's my hope that in the question and answer period and in conversations that I'm able to have with you all throughout the rest of the conference, that I can get your insights. The book is both an empirical examination of the movement for Black lives and a theoretical examination of its political philosophy. And today I present you with the political philosophic part, but I'm also happy to answer empirical questions as well, in terms of, because I'm a social movement scholar, sort of the organization of the movement, the kind of way it works and how leadership works, and some of that I'll need to do just in order to build out the political philosophy as well. Okay, with that introduction, I'll go ahead and start. Okay. Trayvon Martin was not the first Black boy killed for being out of his proper place. Because homicide statistics are poorly kept and vary wildly between reporting agencies, we do not know how common it is for Black people to be hunted in neighborhoods where they are deemed suspicious. We do know that America has a long history of attacking and killing Black people deemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, from sundown town to stop and frisk policing. To be Black in America is to be suspiciously out of place, perceived, as Du Bois wrote, as a problem, and therefore to be ever in danger of violent preemptive retaliation. Alicia Garza recalls, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter Global Network, recalls that on the day that the jury deliberated on the fate of George Zimmerman, she was in a bar with her husband and 2 friends awaiting the verdict. Quote, "Everything went quiet, everything and everyone, and then people started to leave en masse after the verdict was announced. The one thing I remember from that evening, other than crying myself to sleep that night, was the way in which, as a Black person, I felt incredibly vulnerable, incredibly exposed, and incredibly enraged. Seeing these Black people leaving the bar, and it was like we couldn't look at each other. We were carrying this burden around with us every day of racism and white supremacy. It was a verdict that said, Black people are not safe in America." Alicia Garza penned a Facebook status that soon went viral. She called the status a love letter to Black people. It read, "The sad part is, there's a section of America who is cheering and celebrating right now, and that makes me sick to my stomach. We gotta get it together, y'all. Stop saying we are not surprised. That's a damn shame in and of itself. I continue to be surprised at how little Black lives matter, and I will continue that. Stop giving up on Black life, Black people. I love you, I love us, our lives matter." So importantly, this appeal that she writes is not to white people or the white gaze, it is to Black people. Her affirmation that Black lives matter is something that is community-directed, right? Self-directed and community-directed. Don't say that you always knew that this was going to happen. Don't say that you're not surprised, right? Value us, right? Value yourself, value us. So, though young Trayvon's murder was the occasion for Alicia Garza to write her love letter, which her friend and fellow organizer Patrisse Cullors hashtag Black Lives Matter, in the years to follow, the mobilizations of the movement were most often aimed at what Veshel Weaver has called the carceral state. This is because it wasn't Zimmerman's murderous actions that were most shocking, but the fact that the system charged with justice legitimized them. It was difficult to believe that though Trayvon's killer was known, he wasn't arrested until after Black people protested for 45 days. And more astonishing still, that District Attorney Angela Corey, who was reluctant to bring charges against Zimmerman on the basis of a presumed stand-your-ground defense, 2 months later quickly charged Marissa Alexander, a Black woman who fired a warning shot in the direction of her abusive husband, with aggravated assault with a lethal weapon, a charge that carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years. In one case, a known neighborhood bully claimed self-defense, a known neighborhood bully who disobeyed police orders, claimed self-defense as he gunned down a boy walking home with Skittles in his pocket. In the other, a Black woman could not claim self-defense, though she was a documented survivor of domestic violence, and no one was harmed. The common denominator in the 2 cases seemed depressingly clear. Black people are not allowed to defend themselves, and they are never, ever innocent. This heart-rending supposition was given even more credence as the boy whose life was cut short was posthumously presented at trial as guilty for his own murder. And then I have a lot about the trial, but I'm going to go on. I assume you remember a lot of it. None of these phenomena, from the lethal vigilante violence to the indifference of the legal system in the face of Black suffering and death, are new. But the Zimmerman trial focused America's attention on the fact that despite the attractive African American family living in the White House at the time, Black people continued to be unsafe. Ta-Nehisi Coates writes, "It is hard to face, but all our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscles, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body." Patrice Cullors, a longtime anti-incarceration organizer and one of the three founding women of Black Lives Matter Global Network, was visiting a young mentee, an inmate at a prison in Susanville, California, when she heard the verdict. "The first thing I did was to literally drop my jaw," I'm quoting, "and then I felt intense amounts of heat in my chest." She started crying, but beyond the heartbreak, she reports, "I was clear that the acquittal couldn't be the only thing that people remembered from that day. There must also be this movement." In this chapter, I argue that the movement for Black lives has developed a new political philosophy, an ideology that cannot be collapsed into what Michael Dawson has called the Black visions of the 20th century, and that it offers something new, namely radical Black feminist pragmatism. Each word in that title matters. Radical, as I'm using it, is a mode of questioning. Black feminism is an ethical system. Pragmatism is a mode of judgment that guides action. Radical Black feminist pragmatism, defined in this way, has 8 elements that I've observed. So this political philosophy is something that I have sort of determined inductively from watching the movement, from reading everything that comes out of the movement, and from a lot of interviews with organizers and activists. Yes, so I'm going to try it out on you. So I originally had a philosophical framework that I was going to put the movement in, but the movement has such a robust ideology that I just want to codify and clarify it. And this is what I've come up with so far. Okay, these 8 elements include, first, the radical mandate. And this radical mandate is something that's not only about the tradition of Black radicalism, as Neil talked about today, right? Like radicalism in terms of revolutionary thinking. It's literally a recitation that happens in the movement all the time as a call and response, and it's authored by Mary Hooks, who's an organizer with Southerners on New Ground. And what she says, and it's a meditation, right? And what she says is, and I'll just actually read it to you. She says, "The mandate for Black people in this time is to avenge the suffering of our ancestors, to earn the respect of future generations, and be willing to be transformed in the service of the work." And this is invoked as a call and response. So you begin it, right, and you say, the mandate for Black people in this time, and then everyone says back to you, right, this thing. And it kind of sets the scene for whatever action is then going to take place. So the first element is this radical mandate. That lives as both a kind of hearkening back to the Black radical tradition, of which activists are very deeply aware. It's a very intellectual movement. But also it's about the invocation in this time and place of what it means to be radical right now is to avenge the suffering of our ancestors, to earn the respect of future generation, right? So it has that temporal feeling that we also talked about in the first panel a little bit, or they did, and to be transformed in the service of the work, right? Which I think is a really interesting part of it as well. Okay, the second element of radical Black feminist pragmatism is an intersectional lens. And this is straight up Black feminism in terms of interlocking oppressions being the ground from which all political analysis begins. The third element is a politics of care. This is something that a politics of care consists in several different elements. A margin to center ethic, right? That means that whenever we're thinking about political problems and how to respond to them, we always think about the most impacted first, right? And so you can think of that as bottom up or margin to center, right? I use margin to center after bell hooks. Another aspect of this politics of care is the acknowledgement of trauma and the commitment to healing. And in all of the movement organizations that I've looked at, there is a position or a council that is about healing justice, right? So you have like director of healing justice, you have a council that is in charge of healing and reconciliation. It's sometimes called different things, but it's all about the acknowledgement of trauma and a commitment to healing processes. This usually includes transformative and restorative justice processes of various kinds to manage organizational conflict. Okay. All right, so politics of care includes margin to center ethic, acknowledgement of trauma and commitment to healing, and understanding of interdependence, okay? This understanding of interdependence is really important because it connects a lot to the centrality of accountability in these movements, right? So accountability is something that is very central to both the internal politics of the organizations and the external politics that people are doing in the world, whether it's direct action or electoral politics or some other form of political engagement. Accountability is a key term, but it's accountability that's not on the model of the carceral state, right? So it's not about punishment, et cetera. Instead, it's about how do we acknowledge and honor our interdependence, right, in various ways. And then the last element of this politics of care, which I think is a very important element and one that is often overlooked, is the defense of joy. Central to the movement for Black Lives is this idea that we are defending Black joy all the time. At every action, at every meeting, at every convening, you will have this invocation of joy in the face of the context of all of this structural violence and injustice is the centrality of the importance of defending Black joy. Okay, so those are all the parts of just the politics of care. And that's only the third element in this political philosophy. So see what I'm having so much trouble. Okay. The fourth element of the political philosophy of the movement is pragmatic imagination, right? And I struggled a long time to sort of like, how do I term this? Like, what am I kind of talking about with pragmatic imagination? But it is, pragmatic imagination is the envisioning of the world that you want to live in and the way to get there, right? So pragmatic imagination in this sense is not utopian in any sense, or maybe it is in some senses if you read utopia in a particular way, but it's not utopian in that it's not about imagining a world that is no place that you can't get to, right? It's instead about imagining a pathway from the world that is to a world that is otherwise, right? So it combines in this moment the fantastic and the practical, and that's central to the political philosophy. The next element is leaderful practice. Leaderful practice. Oh, God. Okay, and this is really important because leaderful practice, you may have heard sort of colloquially people say that the movement isn't leaderless, it's leaderful. This is based on the sort of political philosophy of Ella Baker, in that strong movements don't need strong leaders. So that was a kind of flip comment, but the point of leaderful practice is that you understand that cultivating multiple leaders at multiple sites is a whole process that helps to avoid what Neil earlier called the trap of sovereignty, right, or charismatic, embodiment of leadership, because it's all about cultivating the capacity for social intelligence and leadership and expertise in whatever way you can, wherever you can, among as many people as you can, which leads to this kind of congregational liberation that you were talking about, Yasmin. Okay. And then the last element of the political philosophy of the movement is the goal of liberation, right? The goal in the end is liberation. And this is why the freedom talk at the beginning excited me so much, because it's so central to the self-conception of the ends of the movement. It's hard to overemphasize. Every time I asked someone involved in the movement, why are you in this movement, right? What do you think the end of it is? What is your purpose, right, in the end of it? Every time the answer was freedom, right? But it wasn't necessarily freedom in that word. It was to create a world in which Black people can live and thrive, right? Okay, so I want to be clear that this goal of liberation is not limited to the juridical. It's not about rights per se. Instead, it has embedded in it a kind of futurity and a sense of freedom as marriage, right? Like that it is actually always a process, and that it never ends. The sort of the meditation of the mandate is always there, right? Meaning that you're always in relation to your ancestors and those not born. So freedom is a constant struggle, right? Like, so whatever you achieve at this moment, the next generation will have to achieve, right, the same thing, right, but in their moment, right? The mandate for Black people in this time, the question is, what time is it? Okay, so these philosophical commitments, I just want to say, come from an inductive investigation of the problem of injustice. So not only is my investigation of the political philosophy inductive, but also the philosophy itself is inductive, right? This is a really important point, and I know I'm running out of time, but the political philosophy of radical Black feminist pragmatism is one that goes counter to the normal processes, right, I think, of philosophy, meaning that it's not top down, right? It's not concerned with phenomenology, right? Instead, it's concerned with epistemology, ontology, and lived experience, right? That's what this is where this political philosophy comes from. And it's actually about attendance to specificity rather than the, I think someone earlier said, the paternalism of universalism. Okay. I have more to say about pragmatism, but I guess I'll end it there. Thank you.